session. I would like to welcome everyone very warmly to this fourth and for the moment last session of the lecture series Philosophizing in the Islamic Modern World, an Intercultural Perspective. The series was conceived on the initiative of the Vienna Society for Intercultural Philosophy by Serhan Dui. And I am very happy that we from the scholarly network Philosophy in the Modern Islamic World have the honor to present this series in cooperation with the Vienna Society for Intercultural Philosophy. I am Kata Moser, a scholar of Arabic Studies and Islamic Studies from the University of Göttingen, and I, together with Roman Seidel, who gave his lecture earlier in this lecture series and who is also with us today. So together with Roman, I am leading the scholarly network Philosophy in the Modern Islamic World, funded by the German Research Foundation. The network emerged in part from the collaboration on the philosophical historical reference and standard work, Philosophy in the Islamic World, Volume 4, 19th to 20th century, published by Schwabe Verlag in Basel last year in 2021. It was published in German, but with the translation into English already commissioned. The German book was published by the prestigious series Grundriss der Geschichte der Philosophie, founded by Friedrich Überweg and therefore often referred to as the Überweg. The English translation will be published by Brill. This lecture series as a whole builds on this volume. Anke von Kügelgen, who is the editor and the main author of Überweg, gave her lecture in the first session of this lecture series along with Serhan Dui, who conceived this lecture series and who is also one of the main authors of Überweg. And both of them are also members of our network. The aim of our network is to strengthen and anchor the topicality and diversity of philosophy in the regions of the Near and Middle East in academic research and teaching, to connect the scholars active in this field with each other, and also to make the subject area visible and accessible to the public and thus to spark interest in it. This lecture series hence corresponds to what we are also striving to achieve with our network, and therefore we would like to expressly thank Professor Johann Schelkshorn from the Wiener Gesellschaft für interkulturelle Philosophie for enabling us to present this together. And we also would like to thank Serhan Dui for conceiving this lecture serial in this nice way. The title of today's session is Aspects of the Development of Modern Turkish Academic Philosophy. That means that we are shifting today geographically to Turkey. The first and the second session of this lecture series were focusing on the Arabic language area, and the third session was focusing on Iran. But we are also shifting thematically today. The focus is now on academic philosophy. That means the institutional structures that enable philosophy in modern Turkey. And of course, the question, what kind of philosophy can be found within these academic structures? Our first speaker today will be Professor Christoph Herzog, and I would like to shortly introduce him. He studied in Freiburg Islamic studies in the classical way, meaning with 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and focused very early on since his MA thesis on Turkish, or rather Ottoman studies. He earned his PhD with his work, History and Ideology, Mehmed Murat and Celal Nuri on the historical causes of the Ottoman decline, published in 1996. And he earned his habilitation with the book Ottoman Rule and Modernization in Iraq, Baghdad Province, 1817 to 1917, published in 2012. Since 2008, and after appointments at the Center for the Modern Orient in Berlin, the Orient Institute in Istanbul, Bilkent University in Ankara, and others. He is, until now, professor for Turkology at the University of Bamberg in Germany. He has many articles and book chapters on Turkish philosophy, mainly also in the Überweg volume, on debates in Turkish learned journals, on Turkish and Ottoman intellectuals, and on their thought. Christoph Herzog is going to talk about the institutionalization of academic philosophy in the Republic of Turkey, 1930s to 1970s. I would suggest, Christoph, that you give your talk now, and after that I will introduce our second speaker, Professor Zeynep Direk, and we will hear the second lecture from her, and there will be time for a Q&A after both the lectures. So, Christoph, I would like to invite you to share your screen, and you have the word.
So, thank you very much. This is the microphone. Now I'll try to share the screen. Wait a minute, I have to do it this way. No, seems not to work. Wait a minute, I still have some technical issue here. So the question is, does it work?
It is working. I can see your screen.
So great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. And maybe before I start, one word of warning. I'm a historian. I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm someone who has both an interest in philosophy and a philosophical interest. Which of course influences the way I'm looking at things, as you may assume. One word to the general historical background. I mean, during the 19th century, the hegemonic elites of the Ottoman state undertook a sustained effort to modernize the empire. And it is possible to look at this process in two ways, as both as a failure and as a success. And it is actually both. What had started out as anti-Russian revanchism at the end of the 18th century became an uphill race, first to safeguard the great power position and the international standing of the Ottoman Empire. And after that had proved impossible, it turned into the effort to secure the survival of the empire and to maintain the option for a future renaissance of its power. Now, although the Ottoman Empire did not survive the First World War, a fate that it shared, as you know, with many other monarchies of its time, it had created governance structures that proved stable and viable enough to carry its successor state, the Republic of Turkey, founded in 1933, to the economic and political position that we are witnessing today. An additional remark that has important implications I would like to make here. The concept of philosophy that was institutionalized in the Republic of Turkey was the European concept of philosophy, albeit in Turkish language. And this left open, of course, the question of the indigenous roots of philosophy, Islamic, Turkish, or whatever it could be called. And this question became in turn an important question of philosophy in Turkey, but one question that I will not cover in my talk. Now, in lieu of an abstract definition, I would simply like to propose indicators for institutionalization of academic philosophy And it is actually only the first one, philosophy as academic subject at universities, that I will talk about here. One thing that is important to know as a context is the size, actually. Size matters somehow, right? The growth of the number of universities is a very simple indicator, and it's worth knowing that at least until 1936, in a way until 1946, if you like, there was only one university. And that in the decades from 1936 to 1980, 13 new universities were established. In the 80s, 10 new universities. In the 90s, 44 new universities. And that today, the official website lists more than 200 universities in Turkey, and among them 76 foundation universities, which is a kind of a private university that is, government, foundation universities, WACF University, that are under governmental control by the central authority that is responsible for that, but are not regular state universities. Accordingly, the number of departments of philosophy at Turkish universities dramatically increased, as you can see here. And also did, of course, the number of students and accordingly of personnel. I don't want to bother you with the details of these numbers here, but it has a methodological consequence, and that's why I'm mentioning it in the first place. The period I'm talking about is a period where the academic elite was a very small one. And this has some repercussions on how the state was able to influence it, because it's in a way easier to, if you have a general approach to controlling a system, if you have big numbers, the result, the actually perceptible results of state interference may be different from if you have a very, very small number of institutions and intellectuals actions are directed at. Now, the beginnings of academic philosophy in Turkey starts with one university, as I already indicated. It was called with the Arabic name, the Darul Fünun, the House of the Arts, if you like, which was already founded in the late Ottoman Empire. It has a somewhat complicated history because it had seen several refoundations and several abortive attempts, but it was firmly established in 1900 in Istanbul, and it was following European models. Something that is, I should just mention aside, is that, of course, there was a tradition of higher education in the Ottoman Empire, the medrese culture, which was discontinued in that respect. And there was another higher education tradition created in the 19th century, that of state academies, that in a way was integrated into, in the course of the Republic, into this new academic branch. Now, the Darul Fünun was dissolved in 1933, 10 years actually after the foundation of the Republic, and it was recreated as Istanbul University, Istanbul University. And it already had contained the Department of Philosophy. So the Department of Philosophy was not newly established in 1933, but it was reshuffled and recreated in 1933. A second university that is of importance for the first for the beginnings is the University of Ankara University, which started as a faculty for language and history geography. This is a French concept, actually. It does not make much sense neither in English nor in German, because neither in English nor in German you have this this history geography as a compound noun in a way. It was founded according to French models, actually more in 1936, and it had it just was one faculty without a department of philosophy, which only was instituted in 1939. And the whole faculty only became a university, officially a university, 10 years later, after the death of Atatürk in 1946. Now, university I will not talk much about here, but which is important because it is the third university that provided a graduation program in philosophy, was the Hacettepe University, founded in 1967. And one thing I should also mention, because to clarify things, is that, of course, these were not the only universities until that time, until the 60s, that employed philosophers as staff for offering classes in philosophy. There were many others already, but that was only as an additional part of their curricula. So to study philosophy, it was only possible in these three universities. Now, I already mentioned the university reform of 1933. I will not delve down in the details here, but it is often interpreted as bringing the Ottoman Dar el-Funun into line with the ideological framework of the 1930s Republic of High Kemalism. The reform is also claimed of being accompanied by politically motivated cleansing of the teaching staff, which actually seems to be basically true. It's an important aspect, but there is a really, really important element of political arbitrariness to be viewed here. And this is also true for the Department of Philosophy, which was a small department, of course. I have one example that is the standard example that is always quoted, is that Ismail Hakkı Baltacıoğlu, famous Turkish intellectual later on, and later on he found access to the university system, was laid off, while another professor, Mustafa Şekip Tunç, was transferred to the new university. And politically, this did not really make sense. Both were former members of the oppositional Free Republican Party. Both were not really fundamentally opposed to the Republic or anything. And if so, then it would be rather true for Mustafa Şekip Tunç than for Ismail Hakkı Baltacıoğlu. So no really strictly definable politically motivated cleansing, although this element is important. And another important factor in the cleansing of teaching staff was very simple, that Turkish academicians that were formerly in higher positions were simply replaced in favor of foreign ones. Mostly, of course, German at the time. For example, in the case of philosophy, Hans Reichenbach took the position of somebody who was replaced. Now, Hans Reichenbach is somebody who is, of course, because he's famous in at least in the analytical branch of philosophy, is often talked about in the context of his Istanbul time. He was not for a very long time in Istanbul, from 1933 to 1938, when he left for the University of California in Los Angeles. And well, I mean, it's interesting. When he came to Turkey, there was no basic knowledge available for post-Aristotelian theory of logic at all. On the other hand, what additionally made the task complicated is that he did not speak any Turkish. So lectures had to be translated by an assistant, actually shortly before he held them, an hour or so, and he faced tremendous difficulties in adequately communicating his philosophical message. Now, the interesting thing here is that philosophy at the University of Istanbul after Reichenbach left, developed a somehow eclectic, continental, strictly non-analytical philosophical outlook, with a diversity of approaches, actually, which we will, I think, hear more in the second talk about, and with a certain emphasis on the history of philosophy, which was partly by the influence of Ernst von Aster, another German philosopher, historian of philosophy, who was teaching at Istanbul University. Now, one thing that is comes to mind is, or that is visible, is the emphasis on the history of Western philosophy in that context, and the exclusion of the history of Islamic philosophy at the Department of Philosophy in Istanbul at the time. Although there was actually in the beginning, there seemed to have been plans to include some kind of Turkish history of thought in a person of Hilmi Ziya Ülken, who taught these lectures, but who increasingly became marginalized in the philosophical department in Istanbul, and who complained about that. Now, one result, of course, of this concentration on Western philosophy in Istanbul is that the question of the identity of philosophy in Turkey was not tackled there again. To jump at Ankara University and the philosophy there, I mean, the department there was initiated by a famous Turkish intellectual, Hasan Ali Yücel, who is one of the representatives of the Turkish humanism in a way, was the state secretary for education, and the department of philosophy was initially led by Olivier Lacombe, a French philosopher and interestingly Indologist. And as I think I already said before, it was the French university model rather than the German one that was brought into existence here. Necati Akder, again, French, with a French background, he had earned his PhD in Paris, became successor of Lacombe. And what happened then is a very interesting thing, actually. Sorry for abbreviating it here grossly. The eminent historian, I mean, to put it really in rather drastic words, the eminent historian of Islamic science, Aydin Sayılı, hijacked actually the department, and together with Akder, who had similar interests, gave it a focus on Islamic science, and philosophy. Islamic science meaning not Islamic theology actually, or jurisprudence, but science in the natural science, medicine, and all these areas, which is a very, very interesting and under-researched topic, of course, but it was done within the frame of philosophy. And this development, in a way, was reinforced by the institution of a theological faculty in Ankara in 1949, which in turn, and this is very interesting, had its own sub-department, if you like, in which, again, Hilmi Ziya Ülken, who was transferred from Istanbul, again, a long story, in 1960, had an important position. And it's also interesting that his student, Kamuran Birant, was among the first, if not the first, actually, woman who become professor in Turkey in the theological faculty, actually, dealing with philosophy. So this is, and she was a specialist in hermeneutic, pre-Gadamer hermeneutic. Very, very interesting thing. Now, the third piece of the puzzle I want to present here is actually the Middle East Technical University, METÜ, in Ankara, that was founded in 1956 or 59. Again, there was a gradual founding according to the US-American model. And here, of course, philosophy, because it was a technical university, had only a supplementary role in the beginning. And there were essentially three philosophers, Cemal Yildirim, Hüseyin Batuhan, and Theo Grünberg, who, in a way, heavily influenced the development of this of philosophy at the METU. And all three of them were proponents of philosophy of science, of analytical philosophy, and modern logic. And that was actually what became the predominant philosophical approach at METU. Yildirim acquired his PhD in educational science at Indiana University, and he was actually, in a way, an autodidact in modern logic and philosophy of science, but very successfully so. Batuhan, again, got his PhD from Istanbul University with a thesis on Kierkegaard and later converted to analytical philosophy, and again was kind of autodidact in analytical philosophy, right? And the third, Theo Grünberg, graduated from chemistry from Istanbul University, and again was an autodidact in modern philosophical logic, albeit, again, a rather successful and gifted one. So this is a very interesting coincidence in a way, right? One word about Kemalism and philosophy. I mean, Kemalism was certainly influenced by pragmatism, scientism, positivism, social Darwinism, and materialism. And I think it's fair to say that there was no top priority for philosophy in its social and educational engineering program. And I could not help but quoting some famous words by the Ottoman historian Mehmet Şükrü Hanioğlu, who put it in rather drastic words. Maybe he would not repeat that today, but I think it's very much up to the point when he's saying that in the ideology of the modern Turkish Republic, we observe the final stage of vulgarization of vulgar materialism, of the German vulgar materialisms. And he said the further debasement of late Ottoman popular materialism at the hands of the founders of modern Turkey produced one of the most unsophisticated but pragmatic ideologies of modern times. Now, this may be unfair to a degree, but it serves to really underline that philosophy was not the main target, not the main vehicle of Kemalist ideology to work out its program, so to speak. On the other hand, it should be mentioned that an eminent philosopher at Istanbul University, Macit Gökberk, actually tried to define the function of Kemalism as enlightenment in the context of the Kemalist model of authoritarian catch-up modernization. So there was the attempt of philosophers, of Kemalist philosophers, actually to give philosophy a place or to reinterpret, let's say, Kemalism in a philosophical way. Now, if we look at this this pair of opposing pair of planning and contingency. Now, the employment of Reichenbach in Istanbul seems actually to fit the scientist positivist ideology of high Kemalism in the 30s. Now, the interesting point here is that obviously there was no evidence found that this was really a planned coincidence. So this was not the result of a top-down strategy, but it was rather the result of a very complicated process. On the other hand, it's very clear that Reichenbach did not manage to impose his philosophical approach to the Department of Philosophy at Istanbul University, because the department rather seemed to keep its path of continental philosophy with German emphasis. And it may be worth underlining that there is a certain sense of continuity, because the philosophical department was not founded in 1933. There were already philosophers there, and they continued in a way this tradition, but they shifted more to the German side, although, of course, in the last phase of the Ottoman Empire, there were German instructors at the Dar el-Fünun, so maybe even this German influence predates the 1930s. Now, there seems to have been in Istanbul some initial intent to make notably the Turkish history of philosophy part of the philosophical canon at Istanbul University. And it seems that Hilmi Ziya Ülken was employed for that reason. Obviously, this was a kind of intervention from above, but it's not totally clear. What is clear that for Istanbul, this attempt failed for the time. Later, it was changed. Of course, today, things are completely looking different. Already in the 1970s, this started. No discussion about that. But at the time of the institutionalization process, this simply failed. On the other hand, philosophy at Ankara University only implemented after the death of Atatürk, was implemented, right? And this philosophical department was dominated by the history of Islamic science and of Islamic philosophy. There was not much discussion about Western philosophy within the department of philosophy, rather than in a way in the department of theological studies by Hilmi Ziya Ülken, who had always this double interest in European philosophy and Islamic philosophy. Now, as to Reichenbach's legacy, that was implemented actually in a way in METU, in the Middle East Technical University in the 1960s, but without his contribution and without being a full graduation program. So as I said, I mean, these were self-taught analytical philosophers, one from the US, two from Istanbul, and they managed to get this running, you know. But there was absolutely no influence by visible or perceivable that can be referred to Reichenbach. So I come to my preliminary conclusion, which is obviously that despite the at times heavy politically motivated state interference, the institutional and political and personal dynamics on the level of university faculty and department seem to have outweighed political directives of state authorities in regard, of course, to the philosophical contents in academia. And there seems to have been no effective ideological planning. There is one, however, I would add, and this will be my final slide, the question whether there is an elephant in the room. Actually, there is evidence on some Marxist leanings in academic philosophy and sociology and elsewhere in the 1930s and 40s that was finally suppressed after 1945. I just give a random collection of things that are tangible in a way. The political ideas of von Aster, the German historian of philosophy employed in Istanbul, were certainly Marxist left-oriented. It's not clear how far they were reflected in his teachings, however. The famous cases of Niyazi Berkes and Behice Boran, who were rightly cleaned because of their communist leanings in 1945 from Ankara, from the University of Ankara. In very interesting case is Hilmi Ziya Ülken, who today is a champion of more conservative intellectuals in Turkey. He obviously adhered to historical materialism in the 1930s. He wrote a book, 20. Asır Filosofları, in 1936, where he translated parts of Marx and Engels and really seemed to support that approach to philosophy. But on the other hand, in 1951, he revoked this approach by a writing called the Refutation of Historical Materialism, if I translate it. And later on, went on to conceive his own ontological philosophy. Majid Gökberk, who in a way had a perspective on Marx that was certainly not that of an orthodox Marxist, but rather a materialist, leftist, Kemalist, Hegelian interpretation somehow, obviously was in many respects, and I would really be interested to learn more about that, and I probably will, maybe in the next talk. He had certain leanings in that directions, and there are other indications as well. He supported one Marxist student who got thrown out of university, and so on. And there was an eminent philosopher who is not very much known in a way, but who was amazing. He did not publish very much, Nusret Hissir, who studied in Germany and was acting as translator for Reichenbach, actually, because he was one of those people who actually knew mathematics and physics. And he seems to have clear Marxist leanings in his later writings, or age at least. And this is probably also true for some of his students, for example, Füsun Akatlin. So Marxism was something that did not work out. It was not possible. Even if there was some leaning, I mean, this was a taboo. And I think if there was a strong tendency to support it, this was actually prevented by the publicly and definitely state-imposed discourse. So this was not possible. And insofar as I said, I mean, this may be the elephant in the room, the example where this state intervention was actually very much powerful and, in the sense of the state, successful. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for sharing your presentation with us and giving us some inside information about the development of Turkish academic philosophy, with many details about the development in numbers, but also with regard to contents, with very interesting developments. They seem to jump from one university to the other without precisely knowing how that happened. Thank you very much. I'm sure that there are many questions in the public also to this talk. I would like to ask you to note them down or remember them, because we are now going to our second presentation. The Q&A section will be afterwards. So I would like to introduce to you our second speaker today, Professor Zeynep Direk. Zeynep Direk studied philosophy at the Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, and for her PhD, she was in Canada at the University of Western Ontario and later in Paris, where she studied with Jacques Derrida, and then she transferred to Memphis University, where she earned her PhD in 1998. After a long period at the Galatasaray University, she has been since 2014 and to this date professor at the Department of Philosophy at Koç University in Istanbul. Her last book was published in English. Its title is Ontologies of Sex, Philosophy in Sexual Politics. It was published at Rowman and Littlefield International in 2020. Other books of her appeared in Turkish, and I just give you two examples. One is translated into English, The Experience of Otherness, Essays on Continental European Philosophy, published in 2005, and The Construction of Sexual Difference, Gender as a Philosophical Problem, published in 2018. Zeynep Direk also contributed to Überweg. Her research areas include feminist philosophy, contemporary French philosophy, ethics and value theory, social and political philosophy, and the history of Turkish thought. And it is especially of this last research area that she will draw on for her talk today. The title of her contribution is The Ideal of Turkish Modernity in Turkish Philosophical Humanism. And with this, I give the word to Zeynep, and I just need a moment to share the document. Zeynep, your microphone is still muted.
You can share the screen, but I can read my document from my computer, so you don't have to worry about scrolling down, conforming to my reading.
Okay, great.
Thank you for the very nice invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today. So the title is The Ideal of Turkish Modernity in Turkish Philosophical Humanism. In the Turkish philosophical scene, philosophical anthropology and value theory have been ardent philosophical buttresses of Turkish modernity. Inspired by Nikolai Hartmann and Max Scheler, Turkish philosopher Takiyettin Mengishoğlu and his pupil Ionna Kuchuradi created an academic tradition which I shall call Turkish philosophical humanism, academically educating and influencing various generations of Turkish philosophers. Mengishoğlu, a student of Hartmann, is the founder of that school, and Ionna Kuchuradi, who began her career as his assistant, played an important role in institutionalizing this tradition. Born in 1934, Kuchuradi is still teaching at Maltepe University and continues to hold the UNESCO Chair of Philosophy and Human Rights position that she has had since 1998. Her capacity to create long-lasting philosophical institutions is impressive. One needs to look at her CV to take cognizance of the degree of the institutional power and international recognition she has received. She has an international reputation and public appreciation no other Turkish philosopher has ever had. That does not mean at all that her philosophical position is well understood. She might even be seen as holding an outdated philosophical humanism after post-modern philosophical trends. Coming from Mengishoğlu's ontological philosophical anthropology, she sets the anthropological knowledge about human being at the center of her ethics and politics. Her contribution to the philosophical school I call Turkish philosophical humanism is her value theory and philosophy of human rights. The tradition she kept alive has most recently found an expression in Betül Çotukseken's recent work that claims to invent the notion of anthropontology. This neologism is in fact a reiteration of what I identify as the fundamental tenet of the Turkish philosophical anthropological tradition, namely every philosophy has a conception of man and an understanding of moral value that implicitly or explicitly accompanies its concept of man. In my talk, I will explain the philosophical understanding of man, human being, underlying this tradition, and observe how this philosophical anthropology and its value ethics positioned itself about the Turkish state. I am concerned with how the school in Turkish philosophy responded to its historical and political world and how it related to Turkish modernity. My claim is that this philosophy gave substantial support to Turkish modernity by giving it a philosophical form, to the ideal of secular citizenship at its foundation. However, that modernist ideal has been challenged by the historicist culturalist trends emerging in Turkish politics beginning from the 1950s. Turkish philosophical humanism offered a philosophical critical counterforce to such new trends in the state. In other words, it opposed the backlashing political tendency to reinvent less secular citizenship with moral values grounded in Muslim religious identity. It has also been critical of the institutional neglect and violations of human rights in the relation of the state to its citizens in institutions such as schools and prisons. But that critique was not presented in a confrontational way, as a systemic problem, but as a problem of the education of the officers and individuals. That does not mean that this humanist philosophy took the state as it is given. It ascribed it a political end. The raison d'être d'État is to be found in the form of the citizen to be cultivated, the philosophical ethical ideal of man as a person. Turkish philosophical humanism stressed that the constitutional law must be revised, changed, and improved for an ethical philosophical perspective, from an ethical philosophical perspective, to conserve the value of man. Moreover, to preserve the principles at the foundation of the Turkish state, it suggested that the employees in state institutions should be educated in philosophy and ethics. Today, we can say that the Turkish state has turned away from that ideal proposed to it by Turkish philosophical humanism. It has changed the form of the citizen it aims to produce, cared less for human rights, and certainly reduced itself to being an apparatus of exploitation of the people by the few, and is going through a self-destructive process as a state. Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu. A student of Nikolai Hartmann, Mengüşoğlu was a follower of German philosophical anthropology paradigm, associated with philosophers such as Max Scheler, Helmut Plessner, Arnold Gehlen, and Erich Rothacker. The roots of the philosophical paradigm can be traced back to the Cologne Circle of 1920s, and its influence lasted in Germany until the 1970s. He published in German Über die Grenzen der Erkennbarkeit bei Husserl and Scheler in 1937 in Germany. Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu's book, Philosophy of Man, İnsan Felsefesi, gives us the foundation of the philosophical humanism's approach to the being of the human being. His book, The Problem of Man in Kant and Scheler, is also important, as Scheler's distinction between the human being as a psychophysical unity and as a person, which is the foundation of his notion of Geist, has been a philosophical source for Mengüşoğlu's notion of ethical and spiritual agency. According to Mengüşoğlu, the human being is a psychophysical unity, but he emphasizes that this unity should not be conceived abstractly, but concretely. In an abstract conception of psychophysical unity, one separates the being of the human being from its achievements or accomplishments. In the concrete understanding, however, the being of the human being is understood as a totality that includes its achievements. First, a consideration of the human being as a psychophysical unity implies the inseparability of body and soul and seeks to overcome the Cartesian mind-body duality. It rejects the ontotheological framework in which the soul is created by God and can have eternal life after the body's death. Human beings are finite in their being and conceived in an abstract way, separately from their accomplishments. However, in the concrete, human beings can live on in their achievements. In its concreteness, the environment or the world, material, natural, and spiritual environment, is part of man's being. Nature can exist independently of human beings. However, insofar as nature has a history in which it is attended to and transformed by humans, nature's diversity and organization can count among human accomplishments. The same is a fortiori true for the world created by human labor, work, and action. Mengüşoğlu and the other Turkish philosophers who followed him did not regard the subject as a willing, valuing, and acting being, as a product of the discursive and non-discursive historical practices. Mengüşoğlu did not regard man as simply a product of historical practices, which he humanizes as human achievements. To be a person implies that one has climbed to a higher step of the ladder of being. Foucault refused to see these practices as human achievements. He opted to see them as impersonal operations of power that invited people to take a subject position. These practices prepare the subject to give consent to being in a position where she's expected to will, value, and act by being subjected to power. That did not exclude the possibility for the subject to have a self-conscious relation to itself. In contrast, according to Mengüçoğlu, it makes no sense to speak of such forces as inhuman. The world is human-made. Still, he agrees that human-made forces of the past can impede human freedom and creativity in the present and future. In general, he sees the environment as a totality of human achievements, and all environments confer a form on the human being. We are born in a historical environment that consists of sedimented achievements. However, the historical environment can prevent people from autonomous self-development when sedimented achievements are rigidified. Such a historical environment is traditional in the negative sense. However, other types of historical environments, for example, intellectual and philosophical environments, may allow us to take a questioning distance to the tradition because they promote a different kind of subjectivity, a subjectivity that takes a distance from its everyday experience, tradition, and historical identity. Mengüçoğlu writes that tradition can rigidify and become like a museum. We may be encouraged or even forced to become subjects through the appropriation of a simulacrum, a manufactured image to reform a reality in a way that is completely cut off from our real life possibilities. I quote, "All environments endow future generations with a form, whether or not people are aware of it." End of quote. When the historical environment is rigidified, it no longer is in a movement of becoming in which it can enrich itself by giving human beings a form that permits creativity. A form conferred by an environment that overcame rigidity ranks higher than the form given by the image of tradition invoked to create an inflexible environment. Mengüçoğlu emphasizes that when education is geared towards forming people to serve a political or religious end, it deprives people of their freedom and creativity. It is difficult for people who are thus formed to achieve their autonomy as ethical agents. They have been formed to be available as a means and ready for manipulation towards a postulated end, whatever that end is. Be it the persistence of the state, the sovereignty of religion, the highly technological way of life, the development in the sense of industrialization, or the building of a strong and wealthy economy. The purpose of the state should not be to form citizens as means, but to make possible the environment that becomes in which people can realize their freedom and ethical agency. If the state is a human institution, an achievement that is part of the environment, and if human beings as a concrete unity is inseparable from their achievements, is there a way to ensure that higher achievements of human beings won't instrumentalize or coerce them? Can philosophers persuade the state to respect its ideal purpose, which is to allow the self-development or self-formation of human beings? The general claim is that even though the historical environment forms us, we can raise ourselves to a higher stage of ontological possibilities and become persons who value independently of historical value judgments. The self-formation culminates in personhood, becoming a subject who feels and knows values and uses that knowledge as a ground for evaluations instead of judging by the value judgments handed down to one by the tradition, the unbecoming environment. This is precisely Ionna Kuchuradi's project. Takiyettin Mengüçoğlu points to how education plays a fundamental role in helping the human being become a person who, having attained knowledge of values, can evaluate situations and state of affairs. Ionna Kuchuradi sets that against evaluating with value judgments that we inherit from our own culture or history. Historical inheritance should not be authoritative in making value judgments. Tradition is not good in itself or cannot be the absolute source of our possibilities. It is here to evaluate. To conclude, philosophers from this school regarded the Turkish Republic as an institution whose main purpose is to educate people, to make it possible for them to become persons. The state does not simply aim to provide security and the basic social goods that allow for an environment where the human beings can survive as a psychophysical organic being. The higher task is to create the conditions in which people can make their evaluations as ethical agents. Ulu Nutku, who's another disciple of Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu, makes clear the anti-Hegelianism of this ontology of the human. Even though Turkish people have not gone through the historical stages of Renaissance and reform, the interval gap could be closed by the right kind of education. The education that allows, the education that makes possible the achievement of the personhood. The secular personalism of Kuchuradi's value theory, her concept of individual agency, best reflects the secular citizen model that the Kemalist political system originally aimed at nurturing. It fit well with modernity, which needed a new definition of the human being that could break with the collective and hierarchical social forms. At least until the 1970s and 1980s, the Republic seemed to defend the subject as a person against the traditional collective anonymity in which the individual is coerced as free, a decision maker and actor. To defend the person meant to defend modern Turkey against the backlash of the religious tradition. However, the state has a history and is subject to the power struggle. Thus, the right-wing governments did not support this ideal of secular citizenship and exploited religious identity and the policies of educating people for some end, and adopted the policies of educating people for some ends. The ends are always suspect, for the ends that seem to be general may cover the particular ends of those who are in power. Ionna Kuchuradi. I'm rarely interested in a philosopher's personal life history. Still, Ionna Kuchuradi's personal life is inseparable from and highly relevant to the history I am talking about. She was born to a Greek family. It would be historically reasonable to assume that, given the state policies between 1930s and 1950s, the family will not be spared from the experience of economic discrimination and political exclusion as a non-Muslim minority population. Citizens belonging to these communities could not find positions in state institutions and academia. Remarkably, Kuchuradi never spoke of her experience as a member of a minority group. She did not speak from the victim's position or the perspective of the oppressed or persecuted. Her struggle against human rights violations is carried out from the vantage point of the state's educator, not from the victim's vantage point. Given that the oppressed could not speak and would not be heard, it is remarkable that she chose to speak and could speak from the philosopher's strong absolute authority position, the possessor of the ontological knowledge about the human being and the knowledge of ethical values. The prominence of her philosophical subjectivity made her ethnic, religious, and gender differences unimportant, irrelevant, and effaceable, empowering her as an interlocutor addressing the state. Indeed, this was the only subject position that gave her a voice. This subjectivity was formed by the philosophical and intellectual environment of Mengüşoğlu's philosophy, which assigned it a purpose to overcome the historical value judgments in achieving personhood. Seeing herself as a person with ethical dignity and stipulating in a Socratic manner that the wrongdoer only hurts himself, the philosopher takes on herself the task of showing the state what is right or wrong as determined by her knowledge of values. Being a person demands that one endures with patience the maleficent consequences of the state's political and morally wrong decisions. Kuchuradi was an assistant to Tekiyettin Mengüşoğlu, who was among the academics expelled from the university by the military regime of 1960. The reason for that is unclear. Mengüşoğlu supported the secular republic and was no enemy of the state. The military regime intervened in academia to reorganize it as a way of manifesting its power. Subsequent military regimes would act in the same customary way and continue to expel the academics previously listed. The event had no apparent reason, and Mengüşoğlu himself had no explanation. One could suspect an academic conspiracy, maybe complaints made by rivals, which might involve outrageous slanders. When her chair left Istanbul University, Kuchuradi held the assistant position on a yearly contract. According to the rules, she could have a permanent position only if she gets approval from the department and the faculty. They did not approve of her permanent status, which can mean that there was little desire to respect and conserve Mengüşoğlu's academic legacy. We do not know the reason why she was not supported. Was it because she was a disciple of Mengüşoğlu? Because she was a minority woman? Was she not sufficiently qualified? She ended up going to Erzurum Atatürk University Department of Philosophy to work. Erzurum is in the east and perhaps one of Turkey's most conservative right-wing nationalist cities. Again, she had no complaints about the difficulties of being there as a single young minority woman in a dominantly male environment. She kept the most austere and serious posture as a person, probably because only distance and respect could protect her. In one of her interviews, she said students liked her very much in Erzurum because they were used to being discriminated against and had a different experience with her. Students who could be Kurdish and Turkish, considered Eastern and therefore culturally rated lower, found in her a faculty member who treated them equally with respect owed to persons. This is how she felt about her contribution to that academic environment. She happened to have positive relations with the administration and was offered to move to Hacettepe University by the rector of the Erzurum Atatürk University. In Hacettepe, her presence was appreciated by İhsan Doğramacı, and she was assigned the chair of the new. She was assigned the chair position in the Department of Philosophy. Indeed, the department was trusted in her hands. As she puts it, she created a department that allows the students to see the possibilities of the discipline. Then she created a Center for Human Rights. The creation of the Philosophy Institution of Turkey, and I later write that Philosophy Institution Turkey in 1974, crowns her institutional success. Meanwhile, it is possible to see that other predominantly male philosophers resent her rise as the chair of the Philosophy Institution Turkey. Her institution was secular and saw philosophy as transcending historical cultural values intertwined with religious beliefs. Against Kuchuradi, who held her institution strictly in her control, many philosophers who sought a philosophy that is also culturally Turkish and Muslim created the Turkish Philosophy Association, Türk Felsefeciler Derneği. The contrast between Turkey and Turkish in the names of these institutions is telling. Turkish is a designation for cultural identity in the second name, whereas the first refers to the philosophy done in Turkey. The programs and organizations of these two institutions are worth comparing. Today, the second institution is more active in Anatolian universities, it seems to be strongly supported by the existing establishment than the philosophy institution Turkey, which seems confined to the small group around Kuchuradi. The journal Felsefe Dünyası promotes academic productions on Islamic philosophy besides works on the history of European philosophy and comparative studies that compare Islamic philosophers with Western philosophers. Their latest seminar is about family values, a governance project to counter feminist political discourses that challenge the traditional Turkish family. The contrast between these two philosophical associations reveals where Turkish philosophical humanism stands and how marginalized it has become. The moment of self-reflection. The moment of reflection appeared in values literature, değerler yazın, when Kuchuradi discussed the question about the correctness of evaluation by reading a story by Bilge Karasu. He was her colleague, a lecturer in the philosophy department in Hacettepe University. Kuchuradi held that literature had a role in the exhibition or concretization of moral values. The theory of values consisted of abstract knowing. However, that knowledge could be concretized by examples from literature, and concretization was important for moral education. In values literature, Bilge Karasu is one of the three authors she takes up, Zoe Carelli and Albert Camus being the others. All three writers have protagonists who have to face a new situation where they have found themselves, which they have not created. The situation is undesired and may involve, at first sight, oppression, a pressure. As Kuchuradi qualifies them, none of these characters belong to the multitude. They are trying to take cognizance of their identity in that new situation. They're trying to cope with the identity the situation confers on them. We ascertain that they're not of the multitude because they can say no. They dare to say it, even if they know sticking with no shall lead to their deaths. In Kuchuradi's reading, all three authors discuss heroism in relation to fear, love, consciousness, and fate. In A Long Day's Evening, originally published in 1971, Bilge Karasu depicts a situation marked by the policy of iconoclasm of the Byzantine Emperor Leon III, who brings a wide ban on the religious images and persecutes the supporters of their veneration. Andronikos is an old priest, an example to follow for Iokim, who happens to be one of the two younger priests. Given the new situation, the three priests begin to question themselves by evaluating their experiences, actions, and omissions. Andronikos' actions and what he affirmed in his inner experience accorded with the morality of his faith. There was no contradiction between his religious faith and what is present to him in his psychological life, emotions and thoughts, and action. But now, how would he see himself in the face of Leon's decision? Andronikos had entered the monastery when he was 18 by choosing to be castrated because he wanted to persuade himself that love in the higher sense sustained the whole universe. He's someone who can endure solitude and be alone with himself, even in the crowd. He is 33 years old now, caught between two necessities, his fate and Leon's orders. He is about to meet an image of himself that contradicts himself. Why did he do what he did until today? Did he live and act as he did because he believed or wanted to see himself as a courageous, strong, and likable person? To say no to Leon's commands will make him a hero, will make a hero of him. But acting to become a hero, to continue to like oneself as a hero, goes against the value of religious modesty. Therefore, he should not say no. Andronikos does not question the rightness or wrongness of the rule, the ban, as he's concerned with what he should do. If he obeys Leon's policy, his life will not change. He would be conserving the status quo, the existing order of the world that has so far connected him with others. But should he remain attached to that past, his habitual environment and habits? If he does not obey the iconoclastic policy, he would be sent to prison, of which he is scared. But acting on his fears implies that his faith is not as strong as he believes it is. Given the new conditions, he cannot protect his honor. Changing his faith makes the life he lived so far a lie. The only way to protect his image seems to flee, but one cannot once and for all escape from an image that contradicts the self. So he returns to the monastery, says no, and suffers the punishment he is given. We can remember Scheller at this point, who introduced in Human's Place in the Cosmos, published in 1928, the principle of spirit over and above the principle of life in general. Although the spirit depends on the organic, it only emerges with 9 Sagen Konen and constitutes a twist in the phenomenon of life. According to Kuchuradi, in this story, Bilge Karasu re-evaluates the meaning of Andronikos's heroism. She adds the following statement of her own. In the kargasha of our age, this is a Turkish word that can be translated as strife, disorder, conflict, and a hero would be the person who lives their life with full consciousness, the person who makes her image correspond with herself, or a person who does not need her image. Andronikos is not just a struggle to correspond to one's image, self-consistency and loyalty to the narrative of one's life. Still, the value of the fidelity to religious faith is the basis of and can trump heroism motivated by the value of consistency. Here, the point is not the superiority of the value of religious faith as such. The point is that in making evaluations, some higher value to which the self is attached may determine one's ethical act in a conscious process in which other values too are recognized. And Kuchuradi remarks that upholding that higher value can make the person sacrifice the image. The term image can mean how others see us, our image in the face of others, or our image as we see it ourselves. The hero is the person who may not need the image. Although the statement is brief, the disjunction is remarkable and can be a key to Kuchuradi's position concerning the new political situations created by the Turkish state. She probably found herself in a position similar to Andronikos's on various occasions. For example, she was not resigning from academia when the military regime expelled academics in 1980, keeping silent when academics for peace were expelled for signing a peace petition. She could have taken a position and said no, and her no would have impacted. That would have made her be positioned as a political dissident. And being a political dissident, she could have lost the institutional power she has. How could she reconcile the silence, which could be seen from the outside as a tacit yes saying, with her image as she sees it? Even when they don't go to prison, no sayers will be expelled from the institutions. Nonetheless, one can choose to sacrifice one's image by not saying no and continue to struggle for higher values, in her case, human rights. In her brief comment on Albert Camus' The Plague, she writes that heroism today will fight killing to give people the possibility to live. Whatever the reason is for killing, whether it is the preservation of the state or the happiness of the oppressed, killing is wrong if one can change reality by transforming the valuing consciousness. In her short essay written in 1970s, From Human Rights to the Concept of the State, Kuchuradi states that the problem of the state is not sufficiently addressed. When she wrote that text, the clash between left-wing militants and right-wing militants, whose aims conflicted because the left-wing militants aimed at overthrowing the state for revolutionary ends and the right-wing militants wanted to protect it, was very intense. What is Kuchuradi's philosophical response to it? She writes that there is little attempt to connect the state with human rights, even in the philosophical treatises written on the state. The state is imagined as an entity to be destroyed because it oppresses people or to be protected to assure a people's historical existence. Going beyond the disagreement between right and left-wing politics on whether the state should be abolished or protected, Kuchuradi turns to the philosophical question of what is a state. Setting aside the functioning of the state in international relations, the state is a human institution with two functions located in the relation of the state to its citizens. Now, given the knowledge of the end, the question becomes how to determine again the functions of the state in different historical worlds and create the organs to carry out and fulfill these functions. Different states could be instituted according to different principles. There can be different constitutions that exist in different countries. However, the purpose or the end of that human institution is irreducible to these principles. What is the purpose or the end of the state as given in these two functions? To determine the first function, we need to turn to the being of a human being, the conditions of the being of a human being, to human beings' structural properties. The foundation of the state is not to be sought in historical conditions. They are to be found in philosophical anthropology. So the question of what a human being is translates into the question of the conditions of being and structural properties of human beings. States exist to meet these conditions, to make them possible. Having Hartmann and Scheller in the background, Kuchuradi argues that human beings are psychophysical, biopsychical unities and beings with ethical volitions. A human being can appreciate values, set norms, and live according to those. If the state's purpose, its reason is to create the conditions for perpetuating the being of human being as a biopsychical unity, the answer is affirmative, though partial. The state aims at making the actualization of ethical capacity and personhood possible, without which ethical self-realization is impossible. Given that the anthropological understanding of human beings as a biopsychical unity is inseparable from human achievements, the ethical aspect of the being of a human being is a higher, though contingent, achievement. It's not possible to attain personhood in a corrupted state. It is not impossible to attain personhood in a corrupted state and continue to preserve one's dignity as a person if one encounters an intellectual and philosophical environment. This is rare, though it could happen. The state is an achievement on the way to that higher achievement because it provides the condition for a human being to self-realize on the ethical plane. But the state can fail in that function and merely aim at preserving the citizens as psychophysical unities. Under these conditions, the heroic act is to devote oneself to maintaining the intellectual environments that allow for ethical self-realization as valiant persons. The state's purpose or end is to transform the social relations that are accidentally, contingently, and arbitrarily configured in history, making them legal and just relations. Nature, provided that nature too has a history and is entangled with human history, including the relations of power inherent there, produces inequalities. The state comes as a response to these inequalities to prevent them from becoming worse and more violent. There were rights, duties, and social roles before the state, but they could lead to injustice. the state's existence does not correct all inequalities. Still, as a legal institution, it makes everybody free, as a citizen capable of reclaiming their human rights before the law. When the state disregards human rights, it is perverted in its purpose. Struggling to make the state remain loyal to its purpose might require the person of the philosopher to go through the ordeal of heroism. As someone who could say no, she might choose to renounce her image by not saying no in a confrontational political statement and continue a program promoting value education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zeynep, for your very intense and informative presentation. You didn't only give us insights into the academic structure of philosophy, but also on the interplay between the theories that were produced within these academic institutions and how they were again influencing the academic outline of the academic philosophy itself. So thank you very much for this these insights and this presentation. I would like to open up now the floor for the Q&A section. So the public is warmly welcome to join in with questions. You can signal to me that you have a question on whatever way you would like to. Use the chat or use the raise hand function of Zoom, or just give me a sign so I can see it. So the floor is open to questions, to both Christoph Herzog's talk and to Zeynep Direk's talk. Yeah, the first question comes from Urs.
Yeah, hi. I want to thank both of you for your talks. They also complemented each other very well. I have a question that may regard both of you. Actually, where is the position or the place of existential philosophy in its widest sense, starting from Heidegger and so, both with regard to what you mentioned, Zeynep, as anthropontology, and what you mentioned, Christoph, as German philosophy, because German philosophy starting from the 1920s included Heidegger and what came after it. So where is the place of this line of philosophy? Thank you.
I can briefly respond to this question. So Takiyettin Mengishoğlu is from Malatya, a city in towards the east of Turkey, and he has received the state scholarship from the state to go to Germany, but Heidegger refused to have him as a PhD student. Hartmann accepted him. So Heidegger entered Turkey very late, because if he had directed Takiyettin Mengishoğlu's thesis, so instead of Hartmann, it would have been Heidegger, earlier. But that didn't happen. Heidegger didn't want to work with a Turkish student for some reason. Takiyettin Mengishoğlu is very talented, by the way, but probably because he was coming from Turkey, Heidegger wasn't interested. But Hartmann was really nice to him. And he has always been an admirer of Hartmann and has been very faithful to his, paradigm tradition as well. So that's how I will answer that question. So contingent, things are contingent here. Why Heidegger wasn't received and, why Hartmann was so prominent in Turkey.
Christoph, do you have an addition to?
No, not really. I mean, that's the point, actually. I mean, it was because Mengishoğlu was so influential in Turkey afterwards that there was no room, actually for Heidegger for a long time, I believe.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the first publications on Heidegger are in the 90s. Heidegger entered Turkey very, very late. In fact, Nusret Hızır wrote a short essay, introductory essay on being and time, but not much was written.
Hümisiye Üken did as well, very briefly.
Very brief, yeah.
And sorry, what about Wittgenstein?
Yeah, Oruç Aruba translated Wittgenstein, Tractatus, and Oruç Aruba was from Hacettepe University and founded by Ionna Kuchurade. So he worked with her and he translated Tractatus. I think that was in 1986. And there, Arda Denkel and Oruç Aruba had several exchange in the journals, in philosophy journals, about the translation. Arda Denkel was critical of it, and Hilmi Yavuz got involved in the debate. So there's a lot going on in 1980s on Wittgenstein.
Just a short note about Heidegger in Turkey. There is a very nice paper by Zeynep Direk on the Heidegger reception in Turkey, published in the volume Philosophy in the Heidegger in the Islamic world. So very nice contribution that shows actually the presence of Heidegger in the light of the academic development in Turkey.
I remember. Thank you.
The next question is from Elizabeth, please. Elizabeth Kassab.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these two very rich presentations. It seems to me that this Kemalist state had two bogies, two enemies, Marxism on the one hand and religious traditions on the one hand. And so the accepted and acceptable philosophy was a philosophy that could navigate, that could avoid these two. And I remember, Zeynep, if I'm not mistaken, I read a piece from you a while ago in which you explained the establishment of positivist philosophy on the basis of that. And here comes this Greek origin woman who navigates these three, the state on the one hand, the forbidden Marxism and forbidden religious tradition, and tries to sort of insert the value-related humanist philosophy. I find this very interesting, and my question to both of you is how do things stand today, in the sense that is there today this kind of exercise that you engaged in this evening, to sit back and sort of look back at this history of academic philosophy in Turkey since the foundation of the modern state? And is there room for
Oh, what a pity. It was cutting right here. Okay, it does not come back for the moment. We will go back to Elizabeth once her connection is again restored. Here you are, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, your connection just went.
Sorry, yes, my connection.
Once you started with your question. So maybe you just pose your question once again. The context was clearly understood.
Oh, you didn't hear my question?
The question went blank.
Yeah,
yes.
you missed the question. The end of it.
You did?
We missed the end of it. I think you were formulating the question, but we didn't get the question.
Oh, my question is, how does it stand today? Today, is there an interest and a margin for a critical evaluation of this academic history of philosophy in Turkey since the establishment of the state?
Okay, I think that was clear this time. Zeynep, you give a start.
Yeah, I think there are publications on that. I think people are interested in Turkish philosophy much more compared to the past, and but it is new. It is new because there are books written on Hilmi Ziya Ülken, on İsmail Hakkı Baltacıoğlu, and Mustafa Şekip Tunç. But for example, in this Turkish humanism tradition, there are now works on Takiyettin Mengişoğlu, essays written on on his works, and I think Macit Gökberk too has been a center of interest and research recently. So Turkish philosophers are just turning towards the works of other Turkish philosophers, and I think more is coming, but there are already some valuable work done, I think.
Thank you. Christoph, you would like to add to the...
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, it's absolutely true. And I think the interesting point I think I observed is that while there was some kind of preoccupation of inventing in a way a Turkish traditional philosophy, that is not anymore a problem in some ways, because there is a Turkish philosophy, I mean, a tradition of philosophy in Turkey already, because there are so many philosophers and you just need to read them and discuss them. So there's a subtle shift actually in the attention, which is very interesting, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. There is room for other questions. In the meanwhile, I would like to ask mine. My question is actually to you, Zeynep. I was wondering, I was reading and listening now to the concept of the secular personalism of Iona Kuchuradı. And I was wondering, because I have very superficial knowledge of personalism only, but I rather know it in the context of a religious philosophy, Catholic personalism, or even the Islamic personalism of Lahbabi in Morocco. So I was wondering how come this secular shift came about in personalism, because the religiously outlined personalisms, they start with a picture of the person which is deeply religious, one could say, or has a religious foundation. So how does she go around it or surpass this religious connotation in her personalism?
I think existentialism will be the key, and it connects with the first question, because her value theory, especially in its relation to literature, connects to existentialism. And in existentialism, we have this personalism as well. And there are religious existentialists and non-religious existentialists, atheist existentialists. So you can find the notion of person in atheist existentialism as well. And also that's her own interpretation of, I think, this tradition, the value theory. So instead of religious spirituality, she substitutes ethical valuation. So ethical consciousness, ethical person, right? So for her, appealing to religious to the values handed down to us by the religious tradition will be to making use of historical value judgments. So she sets a contrast between valuing with the knowledge of values and using historical value judge. Religion is part of that history for her. So she takes a distance and thus she creates a secular ethical personalism.
Okay, thanks. Roman.
Yeah, thank you to the both of you for your highly inspiring talks and very full of information and also ideas. I think I have a smaller question which goes to both of you, perhaps a little bit more to Christoph, since it arose from his presentation, and then another idea on the question of transregional interactions or transregional histories or philosophy which we could aim at. First to the small question. Christoph, you mentioned that the idea of a Turkish philosophy to be integrated into Istanbul University failed at some point, but I wasn't very sure what was this entity, what actually was Turkish philosophy, since afterwards when you talked about the issue or the topic of Turkish philosophy, that was more connected to these protagonists, for instance, Zeynep was presenting. But I think you had something different in mind. So what was this previous Turkish philosophy that was not actually integrated into Istanbul University? That would be my first question. Perhaps also Zeynep has something to add to that. And then, which I found extremely striking here, and we also tackled on that in our conference last year, where Pascal Roux is also in the room today, had her presentation, the question of the reception of, or the influence of particularly German philosophy on Middle Eastern thinkers, right? Since, as you said, that we have, for one thing, there's Hans Reichenbach and his influence in Istanbul University at the one hand, and then someone like Mengistu who was influenced by Hartmann and Scheler, right? And I see similar influences also in some rather marginal lines in Iran as well. So there is for instance a guy called Willi Haas, right? He was also a Jewish student of Scheler, worked together with Plessner in Cologne, and then he had also some connections which are not so clear to Turkey, but then in the 1930s went to Tehran. So I was wondering if these similar influences might be sort of starting point to trace down or track down trans-regional interactions, and these are the things or the perspectives. With trans-regional, I mean between Turkey and Iran, Turkey and the Arab world, since these are the perspectives which are still missing, right, in our presentations of modern philosophy in the Islamic world. And I find this very interesting as a starting point, and perhaps you have some ideas on that as well. Yeah, that would be it for the time being.
I mean, maybe I should try to very briefly answer your first question. I think it's simply a question of the timeline in the first place, because I mean, 1933, there was little of Turkish philosophical tradition. I mean, there was one Mehmet İzzet. I mean, one could have constructed something, but in the end, I mean, the question was Islamic philosophy and Turkifying Islamic philosophy. So was Farabi a Turkish philosopher? I mean, this was the question. This question popped up again in the 1980s, and it was not very productive in a way. And somebody like Hilmi Ziya Ülken very, very quickly realized that this was not a productive question. So he did away with it and he turned to Islamic philosophy. On the one hand, but he always kept his interest in European philosophy. So this is simply a question when this was asked. Today, it's different today because it refers to exactly what Zeynep told us about the shifting tradition, or the trial to shift this kind of culturalist. So within this framework, you can, of course, try to create a different tradition further back to the past. But this is a different topic then.
Zeynep?
Yeah, I think the tension is between having a cultural identity, religious identity, philosophizing with a cultural, religious identity, and transcending it as a philosopher or as an ethical, evaluating person. So there are two trends, obviously, and the culturalist and Islamic trend is now much stronger in Turkey, and it's in Istanbul University. I think there are more philosophers inclined in that direction compared to the past, compared to 80s and 90s. So in the Anatolian universities, Christoph gave us numbers, and in most of these universities, you will have philosophers who are more culturalist, religiously oriented, and do not continue the Turkish philosophical humanism tradition line. Yeah, but the interesting aspect of the school is to take a distance to that way of doing philosophy by kind of taking over a cultural and religious identity. So they embraced it as an environment. All environments give us some form, and we inherit a tradition as part of our environment, but that doesn't make all we inherit good or worthy of appropriation. First, you need to evaluate as a person. Tradition is there to evaluate, so it's not something you identify right away. Right. I think as a backlash to this modernist, and they accuse this tradition for being an elitist one. The Turkish philosophical humanism's idea of person, ideal of secular citizen, that could evaluate the tradition and take a distance to it is elitist according to the culturalist religious trend, right? So the elitism of modernity, Turkish modernity, was perhaps antipathic and felt as if there's an eye there looking at you without really, by setting a subject who separates himself or herself from the multitude, right? This sounds so elitist that I think that idea after 1980s was rejected or not pursued. And also there are political reasons, right? Like 1980s, the military regime of 1980s, the crashing of the left-wing politics, and the promotion of the religious culturalist identity kind of empowered the other trend to such an extent that they kind of took over today and marginalized the philosophy. But of course, in Turkey, as Christoph was telling us, philosophers are kind of get together, and with what they have or with their resources that can include self-education, can create something, can bring about a new configuration, just as it happened in ODTÜ and it happened in Boğaziçi University and Galatasaray. So there are places where different styles of philosophy are surviving. But if you look at these 200-something universities, in most of them, there is this, culturalist, identitarian subjectivity, or the desire of doing philosophy is not, goes together with with a cultural and religious identity, I will say.
Yeah, thank you. We have a next question from Anke von Kügelgen. Anke, please.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you, for your wonderful presentations, and I'm very glad to be with you here, at least virtually. So you actually, Zeynep, already answered partially one of my questions, namely, what is her standing nowadays in Turkey, and how much is her value theory appreciated and maybe also developed further. So this is, yes, you already answered more or less to that, but perhaps you can add something, several pupils, or how is it developed further? And what I read from her, and I really appreciate her very, very much, Iona Kuchrade, was more on the human rights. And so I would be interested in having your judgment about her value theory, focusing on the personhood and making it stronger and more powerful on the one hand, and on the other hand, on her value theory in connection to empowering human rights. So this is my question.
Yes, I think she takes value theory and personalism towards human rights, in the direction of human rights politics. And I think she understands human being as Taketin Mengüşoğlu does, as a psychophysical or biopsychical unity, but that doesn't explain, because they're coming from Hartmann. You have this layered ontology, layered different strata, hierarchical relations between different strata, but different strata are governed by different laws and categories, therefore they're irreducible to one another, although the higher levels are grounded on the lower levels. So there's a higher level of humans being, and that is the person. So the person rests on the organic body and the mental. However, it cannot be reducible neither to our mental life nor to our biological life, but personhood is also an achievement. So there is such a thing as becoming a person. Basically, the state should respect human rights, and that is necessary for facilitating this becoming, so that citizens can become ethical persons. Right? I mean, if the state, of course, it's all possible to become a person, even in a state that violates human rights, but it is very difficult. I think she acknowledges that. And it is very rare. Only if you find a philosophical environment, an intellectual environment, a different environment, that can be possible. However, as a person, you will always be going through the ordeal of heroism. right? If the state does not respect human rights. So this is why she had these centers, these institutions, and she even educates the police. And, you know, she gives the state officers, the police, the security forces, education in values and human rights. And you know, she cannot afford to say no, because if she had said no, she would lose that institutional power of being the educator of the state. And that she does that as a minority woman is really admirable. You know, I think her theory may not be so sophisticated, and she might not convey it really clearly to the public. But if you look at her life, what she's trying to do is very clear.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Zeynep also had a short cut before, but I think she reached the end of the answer. Okay,
Yeah.
so we have the next question from Pascal. Oh, Pascal, please. We cannot hear you. You're still muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the talks. It was very interesting, and it's great to talk about these topics. It's not all the time that there is such possibilities. So I have a lot of questions, but I will try to make short. And first, I have some questions for Christoph related to the development of Islamic science and philosophy you talked about at Ankara University. Also my first question is if the presence of Nusret Hizr, who was the assistant, as you said, and the student of Hans Reichenbach, contributed there also to the development of a link between philosophy of science and history of science. And I'm wondering actually if there were interactions with Aydin Sayılı, because I think they were in the same period there. I am actually working on Sayılı and his former professor Sarton, and it's also related to the question of Roman about the possible links between the Arabic-speaking areas and the development of Islamic history of Islamic science in Ankara University. And also I am wondering about the condition of the move from İmizya Ülken from Istanbul to Ankara, and if he was in contact with these developments too.
So these were the questions to me, I suppose, mostly. Well, I mean, it's difficult to, it's a long story, but my brief answer would be regarding Sayılı, that although he was not originally in the Department of Philosophy, he was tremendously influential. So he simply managed to, I mean, it sounds negative now because I don't want to put a value judgment here, but he managed to invade this department, basically, right? At the cost of people like Nusret Hizr. That's at least my perception, to put it very, very briefly, right? Now, the move of Hilmi Ziya Öken to Ankara is related, it's similar. There's a very, very close relation to what Zeynep told us of interference of the military 1960, right? Because Hilmi Öken was relegated from university as well. And there was no, I mean, yeah, he was, but what was the reason really? And it really looks as if there was some academic intrigue. It looks to me. I cannot prove that. I have there are no documents in my hand, but I know, or it appears, I know it would be even said to me, it appears as there was a lot of political and personal as well tension in the department in Istanbul. Maybe not only political, but maybe also social. You know, I mean, there was Macit Gökberk, who was really a dominating personality, but not only because of his personality, but also because of his political personal and family background. He was the son of an influential general, you know, who was a friend of Atatürk's, you know. So, I mean, there must have been some elements of that as well. Whereas, I mean, being from Malatya and never really getting rid of this kind of little bit dialect Turkish, you know, as Mengistu had the problem, would make him in a way a little bit inferior in the perspective of these Istanbul effendi. I mean, that's a hypothesis basically. But I think that's the same held true in different respects for Hilmi Ziya Öken, because Hilmi Ziya Öken was an autodidact, basically. He was somebody like Ahmet Mithat, basically. Somebody who was extremely gifted, extremely Jalish Khan. He was really working all the time. And he had no limits, you know. But he was boring, and he was not accepted as a true philosopher by his peers, honestly. And that's why probably, and when he was relegated from university, he actually did not, I think he was, I mean, please, Zeynep, correct me if that's wrong, but he was allowed to come back in principle to Istanbul, but he did not want to. He lived in Istanbul, and he went by train to Ankara to teach there, and he went back to Istanbul. You know, he had enough of Istanbul. You know, so that is, I think, I mean, this is a little bit a shortcut now. Of course, it's very, very superficial, but I think it illustrates the point in a way. So that would be my partial answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to add something. I mean, I kind of pitted Turkish philosophical humanism with the culturalist and religious identitarian desire to philosophize and to do Turkish philosophy. However, in fact, after 90s, there are a lot of new European philosophy entering Turkey. In fact, this humanist tradition was attacked by Foucault, right? The order of things, and Foucault's attack has been really destructive. And when people like Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and this, you know, postmodern continental European philosophy entered Turkey, okay, that was the, you know, also a huge blow to Turkish humanist philosophy, because it looked old and outdated, and this notion of human being was kind of gone, is no longer, could no longer be at the center of philosophy after socio-structuralism, this reflection on power. So, you know, when these new trends came in, it was impossible to, you know, there was a lot of pressure. And it's funny, Ionna Kuchuradi told me when I was first giving my paper on Derrida in her organization, Turkish Institutional Philosophy, don't shake the foundations of the state by kind of working on Derrida. And that's how she, you know, felt the construction could be a threat to the Turkish state. So could be undermining you know, the work she was trying to do for several decades.
Thank you. Pascal, did you also have a question to Zeynep?
Yeah, I have also a question, but it's also a historical question about the reception of Max Scheler, because I was wondering if Bediye Akarsu, what is the relationship between Bediye Akarsu and the tradition you described, and because Bediye Akarsu also wrote about the concept of personality by Max Scheler, and she presented his essay as the first Turkish work on this topic, ignoring all the works of Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu. And I wanted to ask about the position of Bediye Akarsu in this tradition you described.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was trying to consider it, but historically, I'm not clear about how they related, how they interacted, but they both work. Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu has this book on man in Kant and Scheler, human being in Kant and Scheler, and she also wrote a book on Scheler. But that in fact shows us that Scheler has been very prominent in the department. But of course, I'm not sure if Bediye Akarsu was part of this philosophical humanism paradigm, to what extent she was part of it. She is also interested in ethics. She has this book on ethical theories in Turkish. So I think value theory is can be a focus for her, or a topic of interest because of her work on ethics. Okay, so she. I read her book, and it was like a summary of Scheller's philosophy, but I don't see her as carrying out a project, a philosophical project through Scheler, as Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu was. You know, Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu, you know, what the his disciples and him were doing had some political implications, and had engaged with the question of modernity in a different way than Macit Gökberk did. Okay, so I think the way they were engaged with the question of modernity can be compared, because they're not the same. Okay, and I think there's some possibility of reading in between the lines. There's something going on between Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu and Macit Gökberk. They're the two poles, but Bediye Akarsu is not a very strong pole there, and I'm not sure how she's positioned in this, you know, polarization between Macit Gökberk and Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu. Obviously, Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu has been a center of attraction for students, and he could create a tradition, right? And that made him kind of a threat for other philosophers who wanted to maintain a position of power. But Bediye Akarsu was not so, I think, I don't know if probably she was close to Macit Gökberk rather than Tutakiyettin Mengüşoğlu.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure.
I think it was also a very occasional reception by Bedia Akarsu in comparison to Takiyettin Mengüşoğlu and Yona Kuchuradi. It was not.
I think we could discuss this question much longer, but I am checking the time and we are much over the limit. So I just wanted to ask Christoph, is there is your hand raised actually? Do you have some comment or is it just still there?
It's a question actually concerning
for
Zeynep concerning Ioana Kuchuradi, and I just had the impression that she, in a way, sacrificed some of her philosophical work to be able to do all this organizational work. I mean, and this translation. So she did not probably. I mean, that's an impression. I don't know whether you would agree with that. She never found the time actually to have systematically develop her own philosophy because she was so busy in organizing, actually doing philosophical service work, right? For organizing the World Congress of Philosophy in Turkey.
She was the president of the Federation of Philosophical Associations, so FISP. That's a very important position.
And that's really demanding, right?
For Peter Kemp, and that's when Turkey organized in 2003 the World Congress of Philosophy, and it was the most international and intercultural philosophy, really, and it was fascinating. 2,700 philosophers participated, and I gave a paper there as well. She organized that, and she keeps organizing things, and she has institutional work. I think all philosophers cannot do that. That's a great and she continues to teach to this day. She hasn't retired. She's born in 1934. She's still very engaged in teaching human rights, ethics, etc. I don't think she didn't have time to write her own philosophy. I think her own philosophy is there, completed. Mm-hmm. This is all she wants to say. Mm-hmm. But you need to hear her, and you need to she can't say everything very in a straightforward way. I think this has to do with her being a minority person in Turkey. So she speaks very little, in fact, but she said it all. Mm. She has several books too. I think no one is reading her very carefully. Because in order to understand her, you have to take into account the political context, her life's history, and know what she's responding to in an implicit way. She's not very direct, but how can you be very direct if you're coming from a minority community, if you're a woman, if you're, I want to say that once I went with her organization to Samandağ, there's an Armenian village. And we entered a church with Ioana Kuchuradi, me, and other philosophers. And Armenian people there met her with great respect. She's the president of this, president of that. She has this authority position. And they were appalled, very surprised. How could a minority person be the president of all these institutions? And I expressed your name is Ioana Kuchuradi, and you should be, a very special person to be in the position you have. They kind of expressed this sentence very briefly. I heard it, but yes, that's very surprising. If she had this, her minority identity as a Greek, as a Christian, as this, she would never have these positions in Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting topic. And as I see, there's a lot of work still need to be done in this regard. So that is the place for me to thank you very much, the two speakers of today, Zeynep Direk and Christoph Herzog, for giving us insight into this thrilling and living philosophical tradition with so many open questions for further research. I would like to thank also the audience for the active, engaging discussion. Once again, warm thanks to the organizers of this lecture series, Professor Johann Schelzhorn and Sarhan Douib. And yeah, this is the fourth and last session of this lecture series. It has been thought-provoking, and I hope it is not the last lecture in this series on the long term. So I hope there is continuation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Bye.
organizing and participating. I am very impressed and thankful.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zeynep. Thank you, Christoph.
Thank you.
It's all very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ja, danke, lieber Kater, dass du übernommen hast.
Ja, die Aufnahme läuft noch, ne?